Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Welcome.
Hi.
Welcome, everybody. Our panelists and our participants. You're all very welcome. This is a webinar on an expert opinion on rural girls' education during the pandemic, and we all know what the pandemic is all about. I don't think anybody needs to even begin to fathom or to be explained to what's happening. So before we get started, I'll go over a few items, or let me introduce myself first. I'm called Pamela with the International Institute of Rural Reconstruction, working as the Africa Regional Director. So we will have, as audience members, we'll have an opportunity to submit questions to our panelists and guest speakers by typing them in the chat box. Please feel free to send in any questions, your questions at any time during their presentations, and then we'll be collecting this throughout, and then we'll be able to address them at the end of the presentations. Also, please keep in mind that this is a live session and it's being recorded, and it will be saved into IIRR's database. So without further ado, I will now move on to our guest speakers. I will start with Ms. Ati Woku, the CEO of Seeds of Africa. I'll ask her to quickly introduce herself. Ati, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry if you hear some noise outside. It's New York City, and they happen to be picking up garbage at this very moment. My name is Ati. I'm the founder of Seeds of Africa. We're an education and economic development organization that work to provide education in Ethiopia and economic development services in the form of training and microloans for women who live in poverty. We operate both in the US, where we have a small team that raises funds and provides support, and the majority of our team are on the ground in Ethiopia, where we run a school for about 250 children and our economic development program. I look forward to having this conversation on the impact COVID is having on rural girls' education.
Thank you so much, Ati, and we also look forward to hearing from you. Our next guest is Dr. Davina Dagana, a senior statistician and multilateral engagement advisor for Walk Free Foundation. Dr. Davina, you're welcome. Please introduce yourself further. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Pamela. So I'm actually the senior statistician at Walk Free. It's an initiative powered by the Minderoo Foundation. And in that capacity, I've been a report co-author of the Global Slavery Index since we started back in 2013. I'm really excited to join you today. We've been looking at the pandemic very closely, specifically related to how it's impacted women and girls. And in fact, I'll be sharing in the chat box shortly a summary video and a link to a report that we've just put out called Stacked Odds that I'll be referencing today. Thank you for having us.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Davina. We now move on to Dr. Lydia Kemunto Bosire, who's the founder and CEO of 8B Education Investments. Dr. Lydia, you're welcome. Please give us a short introduction about yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here. My name is Lydia, and I'm the founder and CEO of 8B Education Investments. We are a fintech company that specializes in lending to African students who are attending global universities. We believe that human capital is the way that Africa will become an equal player in the 21st century. And that's the contribution that we make to the education ecosystem. Before this, I used to work at the UN, and before that at the World Bank. So I have a past of working in international development from a big picture perspective, and would be delighted to share some of my thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Lydia, Artie, and Dr. Davina. You're all very warmly welcome again. So quickly to start us off, we all know what is happening right now globally. We have an estimate of over 1.5 billion children and youth, and including over 111 million girls right now currently out of school because of COVID. And we know that the impact spreads even way before just, the school setting, and it's going into the home setting. So, Dr. Davina, you mentioned you just finished this research, and we really would like to hear more about how is the COVID-19 pandemic having a huge impact on girls around the world, and why should we particularly be focused on women and girls in the rural areas, and particularly when it comes to their education?
Yeah, thank you,
Davina?
Pamela. So this is a great question because we know that the COVID-19 pandemic is leaving large swaths of the population behind in terms of reaching a lot of our development goals. I think one of the things that we've seen from this year's high-level political forum and UN General Assembly is a real focus on how multilateralism is going to be needed to combat how we've addressed pandemics and achievement of our goals, especially if we want to still reach them by 2030, which is going to be a bit of a challenge because now we've had almost a year of people all around the world with interrupted education opportunities. And more than that, it's not just that children have not had access to the kinds of education they've had before. It also means that a lot of the social safety nets we've developed to touch children, to like identify them and to keep them safe and have other capable adults in their lives have also been interrupted. So what we are seeing are increases in rates of child marriage that are very concerning to us. We see young women and girls around the world that are being forced into marriage because there's less of an opportunity for them to be in school at the moment and less of a legal obligation or enforcement of that. We're also very concerned in general about what this means for unpaid household labor, and that's for women all around the world. In every country, we're seeing a disproportionate burden placed on them as work and home life have shifted online, and it means that we're seeing a pattern of behavior being modeled for girls around the world. That means that on top of any type of work they might try to maintain, they may also have all these additional household responsibilities and duties, and in some cases, it means that children and girls are actually being seconded into those responsibilities early. And we're very concerned that we may lose them at this point without concerted effort from the education system entirely, that they may now stay in these household spheres and helping with these responsibilities and in worst cases being forced into early marriages.
Yes, thank you thank you very much, Davina. We're actually seeing a lot of that, the forced marriages and the early marriages for girls even as young as 13. In Uganda, where I live, we've had so many cases of pregnancies, teenage pregnancies, just in this period when schools closed. So you're right, this is really impacting heavily. And even what you said about the household, the burden going up and it's unpaid, So I think all this is actually leading to higher incidence of global poverty, which we are seeing now increasing, for the first time in decades. And we're also seeing, particularly when we talk about, Sub Saharan Africa, and we're seeing this pandemic being also having a linkage with, climate change and all this coming people. I know that interlinkages. Why do you think, what is happening? Why should we be prioritizing education, and what are the real linkages between the pandemic and climate change, and how do we navigate around that for young girls in these communities?
Well, first we can't think through the impacts of climate change or the pandemic without looking at the economic devastation it's brought, especially on the poorest communities around the world. If we look at Ethiopia in particular, which is where a lot of my experience is in addition to the global pandemic, we've experienced extremely heavy rainfalls that have led into landslides and farmland being devastated, which often ends up pushing girls into domestic labor, both within the home, but also they would have to be forced to go out and find work at a very young age to support families. And we've also had a locust infestation around the country, which also impacts rural areas more significantly. And as these kind of like trifecta of challenges are piling up, at the end of the day, those who get really hurt are women and girls. And that happens in multiple ways from, as already mentioned, but the rise in domestic violence, and with schools being shut down, girls don't really have the space to go where they get support or help outside of the home. Especially in Ethiopia, schools have been used as resources to end early marriage, where girls could go to a school and complain about family trying to marry them early, for example, and those are not happening. And with the issues of climate change and the linkage, the pandemic overly complicates that. When schools are shut down, it is incredibly difficult to reach girls in rural parts of the world, and they are not able to participate in virtual learning, and they also have the increased burden of taking on more work in the home. And as the biggest risk I see there is, although schools have been an incredible tool to help girls come out of oppression, as we get into reopening schools, families are going to start making choices where they will keep their girls at home and send their boys back to school, for reasons that might be difficult for most of us to understand, but are like deeply rooted in both cultural norms and what gets prioritized when there is a crisis. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in figuring out how do we reach rural girls in a time where the reality of schools being fully open is gonna be a long time from now. In Ethiopia, we've opened schools in some parts of the country and shut them down in others. But we're seeing it in New York City. The school system has shut down again because of a spike in the pandemic. So we really have to think through all this technology that the world talks about doesn't reach rural girls. So what do we do? How do we reach them? How do we make sure that we are there for them? Because schools have multiple impacts, not just as a space for education, but a space for socio-emotional growth, support, and access outside of the home.
Thank you so much, Ati. And you've raised a number of issues, the multifaceted, first nature of this pandemic, going from the financial to the
Ati, on the point you raised also about secondary forms of identification, That's definitely something we're concerned about throughout West Africa, and particularly a lot of the strides we were making in the cocoa industry in terms of eliminating child labor, or in the Congo, the DRC, related to the mining of cobalt. Those things really require labor inspectors and regulators to be present and involved. And of course, because of the limitations of the pandemic and the lockdown, we are very concerned that a lot of those protections may have meant that populations that were formerly protected may not be as visible. And we're also seeing something very similar in terms of slavery at sea. So a lot of fishers that are kept at sea for long periods of time, but then typically have their bases in West Africa, we are now seeing that they're being kept at sea for longer periods of time and have less access to ports to ask for help and to be able to do this. So all of that to say, like, certainly you're right, schools and education are not just for the purpose of education, insofar as they're a huge social safety net that we really need to protect and try to reinvent while we're waiting for the vaccine to be distributed substantially, which we know will take longer in certain settings, particularly in the geographies we're focusing on.
Yeah.
If I may jump in there, I actually really think you made such important points. You know, your comparison with New York is so apt. If things are falling apart in New York, how much more are they falling apart in, you know, rural Kenya? There was a wonderful article about 4 days ago in the New York Times about how this crisis is impacting women in the US in a range of ways. Now you multiply that tenfold and you just start to get to the very tip of the iceberg of how this is being felt. The house care situation that affects women, but it's going to affect girls in a household as well. There is the question around labor, right? Where does free labor tend to come from? It comes from girls in a household. This range of cultural related reasons why girls have tended to be valued less, and therefore in a universe where there is already, you know, the number from UNESCO was something like, where are my numbers? 5.3 million kids who may not return back to school when the pandemic is over. We can imagine an overwhelming number of that on the African continent is going to be girls. Yeah. So these are things that they compound over time, and the mileage that we had got with equality, with girls going to school, some of that is being rolled back, and a lot more needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and actually we have a comment here by...
No, please go ahead. Yes, please.
I was going to say, so we have a comment here by Dr. Olembo, and her point is related to what's going on in Kenya with respect to the established pornography industry and a lot of the children that were formerly involved in street-based tourism-induced prostitution, or I'm sorry, it can't be prostitution, it's trafficking, of course, they're minors. But effectively, a lot of those children, in the absence of a lot of tourism and physical and like in-person demand, a lot of them have been migrated over to the established pornography industry, and it is very concerning, because once there's an entry point there are less touch points to be able to help get them physically off the street or out of those control points, because now you're trying to identify where in private homes are they being held. Yeah. To that point as well, about domestic servitude is very concerning. So that was a population that was already really hard to reach, because they're generally kept within the confines of a private home. So whenever we did find them, it was because they were able to access help or someone else was able to intervene. Right now, we have a lot less interaction in the public sphere. So all of these opportunities to get help for people that might need it, women and girls, it's very much diminished.
Yeah, I mean, that's very true. And we also had, you know, some incidents like that, and it is really sad to see what's happening. And again, schools being the, you know, safety nets that they are for many girls, and without those structures, definitely a lot has gone loose. So just going back to Lydia, about you're working in financing for education, technology, fintech, and we've seen that technology has actually sprung up, you know, during the COVID-19 pandemic. But we also know, and I think Ati alluded to that, and Davina, about access to this technology for rural girls. at the end of the day, honestly, even when I see what's happening, in my own country, even in the neighboring countries, um, I think maybe less than even 5% of students and pupils have been able to access technology. First of all, there's issues of cost. Um, the cost is too high, it's prohibitive. The network challenges, even right now, even when I'm here in Kampala, I'm experiencing, challenges with the network. There's the issues around basic access, So how do we navigate that? And of course, financing in such a case. How do we navigate that for rural girls?
Yeah, I know that's such an important question. And I think it's the question that every policymaker who was thinking that digitization of education is something they will have to worry in 5 or 10 years, that has all been accelerated in a context where budgets are facing a lot of competing interests. And so everybody is grappling with that question. The point that you raise is very important because the numbers are really stark. I think it was a World Bank report that was showing that roughly 89% of African children or households do not have access to a private computer. And another number that I saw in that regard was that 82% do not have access to internet. And to your point, Pamela, even when you have access to internet, its capacity to deliver the quality that you need in order for it to be the replacement for the classroom, that capacity is highly constrained. So what does that mean? What I think it means is two things. The first is that governments need to be putting a lot more priority in investing in our digital and online and such infrastructure as much as they have in our roads and bridges. I think the future that that investment that would have been happening in 5-10 years needs to be happening today. We need to be having a lot more innovation with our telecom companies, partnering with the governments and others to enable data to be more affordable. I saw an example on Safaricom working with Eneza Education to get more education more accessible to students. We need to see more of those. So that is one aspect. That's the technology. On the financing, I think we have to go back to the point that both Davina and Ati have made, which is that there are reasons, both financial and cultural, that might make families make choices around girl children that are more detrimental than they would make to about their boy children. And I think what we need to do is reduce some of these challenges that families face around financing. So while we work on the higher education, right, making sure that a girl from rural Kenya or rural Ethiopia can have a chance to become the next Marie Curie, we also think that that has to begin from local basic education being either very cheap or free. Girls who qualify being able to be supported to be in secondary school, not thinking about university education as a luxury, but thinking of it as an essential contribution to the human capital of our population. And that's the point at which I will end. The recognition of human capital as an essential investment in our country needs to be happening. There was an index that was launched by the World Bank. I believe it was 2 years ago. I could be wrong. The Human Capital Index, and it was launched to a lot of buzz. But I think what was so interesting for me was to look at what does it really mean when we say ability is spread evenly globally. But the ability that we have to develop that ability is limited. What they were able to do is to put some numbers, with whatever precision one can do that, we can put it to one side, but they were able to put some numbers to that. So on the African continent, the country with the highest capacity for its people to achieve their potential was Seychelles, and that number was 68. The average child born in Seychelles will only ever achieve roughly 68% of their maximum productive capacity. The next number up was Mauritius, and that number was 62%. And then Sub-Saharan Africa came much later with, the bigger countries in Sub-Saharan Africa came a bit later, with Kenya being at 52%, right? So the way to think about that is that Kenya as a country, by not investing in education and health and the kinds of things that allow people to meet their potential, Kenya will be losing 48% of its potential income and economic power as a country. Those are things that we ought to take really seriously. Investing in rural girls is a sub-case of investing in girls and investing in people across a country. That is a case that should be taken very seriously because it has real consequences on our capacity as a continent to thrive. So I suppose it's a very long answer to your question, Pamela, which is to say the crisis is a push factor for us to do more and to do better for our human capital across the continent.
And I love, if I may jump in on that piece too, I think that, if we try to look at the positives of the pandemic, which is very difficult to do. I mean, there are some positives related to the environment in terms of the amount of consumerism and global travel that was like clogging all of our carbon emissions goals from being achieved. Like there are some positives. And one of the things I think that's interesting in the African context is an opportunity to revolutionize our education system. So the truth is, we were at breaking points in a lot of these, developing countries in terms of our education systems. Anyway, we were having a hard time reaching a lot of the populations we needed. This is an opportunity to reinvest in exactly what you're talking about, that infrastructure, because it is structural. Once we start disenfranchising women and girls as children from son preference to primary education and limiting their access at that point, you're looking down the scope of having women who now have less agency and earning potential as adults. And then as in later adulthood, they have less opportunities to obtain land tenure rights, or they, upon the death of spouses, may actually have less economic viability than they did before. It's an interesting pathway that, exactly what you said, investing in women and girls, specifically girls, is not just a subset of the whole economy. It's a huge piece of that. But it's also investing in what the future of these countries will look like and what will half of the population's access to social and economic mobility be. Are we condemning them because of the setbacks in this pandemic and through their lack of education access? Are we condemning them to intergenerational poverty for another generation on the basis of this? It's a very interesting question about what the gains in investment at this point could yield later on.
As you both were speaking, I went to look up the Human Development Index because I had to refresh my memory on where Ethiopia is. And we're at 47%. And we're on the bottom 20 countries in the FDI. And looking at that, and then just kind of looking at the list of countries, I saw also, the countries with the lower population tend to do better. So that kind of brings up the other question of, to me, like the interlinkage between population growth and the lack of investment in women and girls, which ends up kind of creating that catch-22, because the more women are educated, we delay the first birth by several years, and then that ends up having a significant impact in population growth. And it's just something that I just had to kind of point out, where not to just make it sound like devastatingly complicated, but this time where girls are getting married off early is going to have a significant impact in what happens to them and the children that they have. There is a significant amount of investment required from governments, more than, obviously from civil society and businesses, but really governments in where they put their money. And, our continent is going to be the largest continent in the world, and we have the population, we have the human capital. If we invest in developing it, it is a better investment than any technology that we're trying to to invent or invest in today, we really, really cannot stress the importance in governments to put in more money into education.
And Ati, I think you raised such a compelling question, because that's where I think the natural flow of this discussion has to go. Once we've convinced our wonderful audience that this is the important thing to invest in women and girls, the question is how, right? The question is, in a post-COVID world where we're reprioritizing economic viability, we're reprioritizing even public health standards, which can, in a lot of settings, may have some critical collapsing issues related to how we deal with these stretches now. I'm really curious as to how we can compel governments to reinvest in education among their many priorities, but also not just governments. I think you made such a good point. Multinational companies are benefiting from the human capital throughout the African continent. Where are they? Where is their reinvestment in our growth and our importance? Where is civil society? And that's not just local civil society. There's a huge coalition of global civil society actors committed to like philanthropic giving. And how are we messaging to them that this needs to be the place that we reinvest our effort and time once we look at things like immediate public health access or food resources? Like how are we going to make that collective argument and refocus attention onto the African continent? And I think we were talking about this earlier about potentially more investment from like the United States and other countries in the new administration back into Africa, which I think was an amazing point, if that's possibly relevant to how we look at reinvestment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm sure Pamela wants to jump in here, but if I may, on that very point, Davina, I think there is a role for everybody. And I think what's important is for stakeholders to work together, to work over longer timeframes, right? Not I need to plant my flag in rural Ethiopia. I am going to have a project in the next 3 months that I'm going to then, declare success on social media on and consider it done. These things are generational, right? So the problems have taken so long to grow or to become what they've become. The solutions take equally long. And then we have to have humility about what our interventions can achieve, and an acknowledgement that we need everyone else. So the public space, the public sector just does not have the bandwidth. It simply doesn't. 8B, my company, organized a seminar earlier in the summer where we had, conversations with private sector actors, people who are in the investment space, people who are in government ministries, vice chancellors of universities. And the question was, what is needed for us to be able to provide the education that we're currently not able to provide on the African continent? And one of the overwhelming messages is that there is no one entity, no one sector that is going to fix this. Privatizing education and saying, let the private sector fix this is not going to solve the problem. Hoping the government can fix this cannot. The governments in the global north are struggling with where they get their dollars, and they have a lot more fiscal space than the average African country does. So governments will not be able to do it. So there has to, and philanthropy obviously does not have the capacity to get us to scale. So what we need is a thinking together across sectors, and as I said, for longer, much longer timeframes, and that's where we get that's how we get to the kinds of solutions that we need. I also think there has to be a thinking outside of the box. There is let's do literacy and that solves every problem. That's not it. We need the people who are thinking about solutions to menstrual problems that girls in rural communities face. Those are people who are going to be solving quite a big chunk of a problem that the public sector isn't necessarily acknowledging. We need people who are working on the financing, but of schools, which might enable affordability to happen, but not at an individual household level, but at the cost of attendance level. There is a range of thinking that needs to be happening here. And I think my call is for these conversations to be happening, as opposed to hoping there is somebody who's going to fix it.
If I, may jump in there. I think I completely agree with what you're saying. And I think we also have to spend time with indigenous knowledge and really looking at what do the communities we want to solve these problems for are looking for. Because I think oftentimes, I'm myself guilty of this, we do have communities we work with, but I think we all have to work harder in making sure that the people affected by these issues are at the table, helping make the decisions in how resources should be allocated and what kind of solutions are going to work. Because just to add on to your point, there's no one solution, and it's a complex problem that requires everybody, including those affected, that often are kind of left from the decision-making space on how resources are allocated.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
A lot of innovations here, and I want to go to the bit about government. I think each of you have mentioned government, Davina, Arti, Lydia, government playing a central role in terms of, putting together these strategic investments, the resource allocation, and then implementing these innovations. I'm going to ask you about something that, affects our decision making a lot in, especially here, which is the issue of governance. And I know that some of these decisions are being affected by, the way, the governance structures and context. So what do you think about that? How is that, playing into the whole COVID situation, and just what do you think, Davina? Your thoughts, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that great question, Pamela. Yeah, so I think it's clear, and I'm sure Lydia can echo this from what we've seen at the UN General Assembly this year, is that there's a legitimate concern that governments are going to be incapable of resolving a lot of the human rights issues that have come up through the pandemic as they're looking at immediate post-COVID response and reconstruction. Like, I think there are real concerns that issues such as ours will not be prioritized or understood as a real priority area. And even if they did, as Lydia said, the bandwidth of a lot of these governments are really limited. So when we're thinking about these solutions, I do wonder to the extent that we can efficiently scale some of our solutions. So one of the things I was thinking, and I've been talking to some colleagues about how funding priorities should be allocated among like the global civil society community, because there's a lot of interest in helping to alleviate some of these stressors on women and girls. And I think I keep coming back to this idea that we can't escape the reality that access to quality internet is becoming more of a human right. Like, this is becoming something that if we don't get access for our girls in rural communities, they will be left behind at some point. And I think if we can start revolutionizing the infrastructure there, especially with the world as it will likely look post-COVID, where even for many of us, there will be a component of virtual work and life that had not been a part of our lives in this way before. I feel that that's probably the most cost-efficient way to start. And that's a really powerful point for governments to be collaborating with multinational companies in each of their countries to begin, because I'm really struggling to see a future for rural girls where we continue to leave them disconnected from that resource in particular. I think internet and high-speed internet or broadband internet access is going to be increasingly seen as a critical vehicle for not just education, but work and really life, like fully integrated economic life in a globalized continent, a globalized world. And I keep thinking, like, if I were to pinpoint one way that we could try to bring everyone into the fold, it comes down to access in some ways. I mean, there are a lot of cultural issues we have to address, but without the potential of reaching them with education, without the potential of an alternative, it is going to be very difficult to convince people on the ground that your child should not be, in fact, married off at an early age or helping you in the household business or home. We need to at least get the opportunity for education back into the discussion. And I think that's where internet access, universal internet access, has to be something we really seriously push for.
Yeah, no, I think right now we had I think we had won the battle around education, even if the implementation of it wasn't working. Conceptually, we were there, that every child should be in school, including girl children. Now that is wrapped up into this infrastructural piece that is so difficult to unknot, because now the delivery of that education is online, and it is increasing inequality, right? Those children who already had access, who were in the kinds of schools that provide laptops, are increasingly being able to go ahead, and those children that didn't don't, and they're increasingly being left behind. So I couldn't agree with you more. I think there are some discussions happening around what does this even mean to operationalize that thought or that right. But I do think that in a world where our technology companies are so powerful and they've managed to break democracy in some parts of the world, I'm hoping that they can make right some things by, we need more affordable hardware, we need more affordable capacity to get online, and so on. Now, this obviously isn't made easier, and I go back to this because, Davina, you mentioned the multilateral space. It isn't made easier by the decoupling of US and China, because that raises complications about, what hardware will, the average Kenyan be able to afford to go online with, and if it's hardware that is assumed to be have security compromise, what does that mean? Are we declaring camps by going for affordability or not? And that is above my current pay grade as a thing to resolve. But I think there are big questions that are wrapped up into this. But I'm hopeful that this has been a forcing mechanism, like you, Davina, saying, can we find a silver lining in this crisis? The silver lining is that it's a forcing mechanism for many things that we wouldn't have gotten to, and now we have to get to right now. How do we minimize the damage that might be coming down the pipeline for our young women and girls?
Okay, silver lining indeed. Thank you. Ati, your thoughts on the issue of governance?
The issue of governance, I can specifically talk with my experience of issues of governance in Ethiopia. And honestly, what I would say is there's a lot of will to make changes. But, as much as I say government has to play a big role and funds have to be allocated, Lydia called it earlier, like there's not a lot of money available to make certain changes. And I've personally seen this in meetings I've had with leaders in our education system within Ethiopia to, create certain nationwide projects or programs. And oftentimes they would say, this is a great idea, we just have no money for it. So that's kind of like where the challenge has been. I think there is money internationally, but there is just some kind of, there's generally some lack of coalition that makes sure that the vision that certain governments have for their countries, they may not be able to actually actualize those because of the lack of resources. So I think there is definitely some work that can be done with, especially the larger international development organizations, to really go in to be more of a support for governments to kind of play out some of their big projects. And the reason I say that is, working in Ethiopia and through my experience of doing this for over almost a decade, the reach government has is just, it's beyond any one or two or hundreds of civil society. So if there is the will, then it is where, civil society can show up to support that. Obviously, not every government may have the will to try to do something positive, but there are plenty that are trying that just don't have the resources. And it becomes the same issue like families face between figuring out who to send to school. Like governments are faced with challenges of where to allocate the limited amount of resources they have. So I think there is a way in which the international body can provide more funding and support to governments to help solve this major problem that is going to cause significant delay in the progress that was made towards women making, the life of women and girls better.
Yeah, if I may jump in there. Sorry, really quickly. I think the point you make is so important, and we are in what they're calling the decade of action for the Sustainable Development Goals. A lot of international actors, both at the multilateral, bilateral space, in the private sector, everybody is, twisting themselves into a pretzel. What can they do? What I would love to see is this entities with the resources and the capacity and the wanting to do, aligning behind those who know what needs to be done. In Ethiopia, they need to find you, Ati, and figure out what are the 7 solutions, because you have the lived experience of Ethiopia and what the girls there need, and support that effort. And across the board, that's what needs to happen. Unfortunately, I go back to the instinct towards flag planting. Can I be the first one on this little hill to say, my solution was the first? That does not get us very far. So I think it isn't a problem of no resources. It's a problem of, are the resources being allocated to the solutions that we know work? And the solutions that we know work are solutions that are typically coming from a place of lived experience. And that means supporting entrepreneurs that are typically not the entrepreneurs that the various foundations and entities are supporting, or the startups that they're supporting, and so on. I think what we're talking about is actually just a more inclusive way of thinking about where solutions come from. We haven't been there for a while. And I'm wondering whether in this season of social justice, in this season where everything is up for, rewriting, and, a new era is beginning, we don't quite know the direction it's going to take. Is this the season when we will see an alignment behind solutions that work, so that capital does not continue being wasted for the next 60 years as it has for the last 60.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lydia. And
Lydia, I would talk about aligned solutions. At IIRR, we have the pastoralist education program, where we actually looked at what's the context for pastoralist girls, pastoralist boys, and what is the learning environment, and then adapted to that. So we developed flexible curricula, we have classes, we have mobile classes, because we recognize that these children move, as they're herding. And in fact, there is a question about children from one of our attendees asking about again, the local context, the solutions that work for the local context. So I will ask that question, but great insights from you. Kadir is asking, again, inequalities within the communities themselves at that level was evident when schools were closed. Some families could afford internet and other infrastructure, while majority nomadic have no means, and so online learning is an alien term to them. Live broadcasting on local radio help in remote places. So I think this is one of the solutions that actually would fit a certain context. And as Atia and all of you have mentioned, Davina and Lydia, it's important that we come up with solutions that actually are relevant to what the context is, because sometimes we hear of solutions from elsewhere and then we just want to apply them in a blanket manner. So I think this is really great feedback. And there is another, there's more input also from Kadir saying, there's great potential to change in Kenya and Ethiopia, especially for girls, as supreme cultural leaders have condemned FGM and marriage of schoolgirls, a big stride in the right direction, and operationalizing this decision alongside proper infrastructure and support at program level. I think one of you did mention, I think that was Ati, the need to look at the cultural context, and this is very clear, from the comment we have, that that looking at the cultural context is really key, and bringing in these cultural leaders and people who have, whom the community listens to is very key. Yeah, so thank you very much, Kadir, for that input. I see, Ati, you're saying there's an article that you've written to support this conversation. I would encourage all the attendees to, after this, to please read that article, including myself. I will be wanting to look at it. Yeah, so thank you. Just to go back, do you have any, I see, Davina, you're shaking your head. Do you want to input something around these comments?
Yes, please. I think these are really helpful comments. And, I always think that a solution does need to be localized. I think Ati had mentioned that earlier, that you really can't have a top-down approach to something like this when it's talking about cultural shifts. And of course, FGM, child marriage, these are all things we're very concerned about seeing resurgences of in this context. The thing I will also echo from what Lydia has shared is that, in this decade of action for the UN Sustainable Development Goals, there needs to be, in my opinion, a lot more coalition building around multiple SDGs that actually have complementary goals. There's not just like the primary education for all, but there's also maternal health and a lot of other things that are complicit with the same issues we have here. So one of the challenges I find is, especially in the international policy space, is that there are a lot of funders and people that are interested in working in this space, but they're not understanding, there's not a clear path for them to follow in terms of how they can have the greatest impact. And I think that's exactly what Lydia and Ati were saying about, like, you develop these plans for countries that are tailored and personalized and hit those pinch points. But I also think that there's a component to this where it's incumbent on all of us, any expert in all of these related fields, to kind of say, we're not just addressing girls' education in rural settings. We are addressing maternal mortality by doing this. We are addressing access to public health resources. These are all things that are complicit in these settings with girls' education. And like Ati had said in the beginning, this is a critical social safety net. It's not just education. This is meant to be how we keep girls from being, despite the cultural leaders, despite the laws, despite the implementation, how do we make sure that on an individual level, girls are not being subjected to FGM? How do we ensure that they're not being forced into child marriages? We know that these cultural leaders have made really encouraging statements. Religious leaders have made encouraging statements, and that doesn't always translate into the actual protection of girls, especially in rural settings. So I think there's a real question about coalition building and how do we all participate in that? How do we make sure that local voices, local experts are heard, along with the policy leaders who are not necessarily in the local context, but are the ones being asked where to put that money? So there's a big disconnect in terms of where there are potential funding sources, potential opportunities, but then they're at different levels. So I think that's where this coalition building has to happen. And I think we need to talk to people outside of like the primary education and like the modern slavery fields. We need to really be aligned on this as like a cross-cutting gender equality issue that is something that we can all contribute towards.
And I may add there, Davina, it's actually beyond just gender equality. This is a human capital challenge, right? Because there is something very niche about thinking about it as rural girls, but actually rural girls are girls who are potential future workers and innovators and game changers and ecosystem builders, right? I think when we widen that lens and connect the dots in all the places where there are dots to be connected, you're right, we get to a much, much broader field. And then suddenly we're not really talking about, how do we make that little market efficient where rural girls will go and sell their wares, but we're actually talking about how do we increase productivity of people in this country? How do we make sure that there is education that shifts norm for populations in this region? And so it becomes a much broader conversation. And I can see how there is self-interest in narrowing the conversation, right? There is this big universe and we've all sliced and diced it in ways that allow us to build expertise in particular areas. But actually there is incredible value, particularly as we're wanting to shift resources in larger scale into these issues, in making things instances of bigger things, right? The marginalization of rural girls is actually a problem of us not realizing our full capacity for the potential of a country or of a region, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very powerful actually. Yeah. Yeah, so we're almost getting to the end, and I would like to very quickly, just make it's not necessarily a question, it's more of a comment from Iris, and I think you just mentioned that about thinking more comprehensively. I think, Lydia, you just talked about this, that we need to think more comprehensively about the issue, not just about the child, but looking at this in the sense of the human capital and human development and increasing productivity. I think that bigger picture thinking is we still haven't got there yet. I think we have a tendency to, as you said, look at things separately in a diced up manner, and so we need to get to that place where we are positioning this issue within a broader issue and then looking at it more widely. So thank you. Just as we wind up, very quickly, I would like us to, and this is for Davina, because I know you're statistician, and just to quickly talk about how we can use data within this whole pandemic, and to promote the rural girls education, and of course looking beyond just education, but even how it's interlinked with agriculture, health, and all these things, social development, labor, because ultimately at the end of the day, these girls, who is paying for their education? It's their parents. So that bigger picture. So how does data come in, and how could we use it to promote girls' education in this pandemic?
Yeah, thank you, Pamela. So, data is really critical. We are in a world where data and evidence is really prompting public policy and resource allocation. And we're also in a world where COVID-19 has impacted our ability to fully actualize the potential of data collection. We are going to be coming into a post-COVID period where a lot of global reporting, a lot of the data sources that we've come to rely on will be affected by limited government resources and accessibility and shutdowns during this time. And I think it's going to be a very compelling context during which we think creatively about how to make our case for rural women and girls. And one of the ways that I would recommend doing that, I did share in the very beginning of this chat our report on stacked odds, basically our qualitative research based on all of our survey research around the world that kept identifying more women and girls as victims of modern slavery. And we really took a deep dive and said, what is happening? What is causing that? It is more than just happenstance. There are structural things that are making these women and girls more vulnerable. And that's one way that we can use data to kind of deep dive into a narrative. But also what I would say is we need localized vulnerability modeling. We need to really leverage the data we do have, which vulnerability modeling is based on data that is really ubiquitous, data that's accessible. It's about maternal mortality age, maternal mortality death. We're thinking about how, what kind of access to education, what has been the decrease in matriculation for girls in a certain age group, what have been the increases in incidences of other types of social impacts from negative social impacts for these girls. So I think one of the ways that we make this argument is that we look very seriously at issues like vulnerability modeling, as opposed to identifying cases of just, we need to identify how many people have been harmed and where they are. But we also have a lot of information at our disposal to say, look, during this pandemic, we lost 30% of the girls that were matriculating from before the pandemic. Where are they? What is happening at a local level? How do we get them back? And what are some of the things that prompted them to leave the education system, and how do we get them to re-enter? And that could actually really easily inform what interventions we recommend at a local level. We could say, look, in this instance, it was a lack of economic opportunity for the household. And so these girls are now subsumed into the family business. We really need to understand at very local levels what is prompting the removal of girls from these educational opportunities that we, as Lydia mentioned, we've agreed that this was kind of the priority. We've gotten to that point. But what is causing this backslide? What is causing this reversion? And can we dedicate our policy efforts and our limited resources to making sure that we bolster those areas of intervention to try to bring them back into the educational world as quickly as possible?
Okay, thank you so much, Davina. That's great insights. 1 minute or 2 minutes, last words. I'll start with you, Lydia.
I am so grateful that you gave us an opportunity to have this discussion. I hope that participants are as excited as we are about the potential for coalition building, to use Davina's words. I think the most important thing for me is to think about how that continuum is relevant in all our engagement, so that when we're talking about higher education and making sure that Africans can access world-class higher education just like anybody else in the world who has the potential and the opportunity should be able to access it. We want to not lose sight of the symphony of solutions that we need. We need at the rural girls level where there is no access to literacy and there is no safety and all the things that Davina has talked about that increase vulnerability, that those things are addressed. We need to be advocating for the fact that at the primary and secondary school education level, all the barriers to girls' enrollment that then get in their way of realizing their potential, those questions are addressed. And then at the tertiary level, where there are questions about quality, but also questions around financing, which is where we play, that is also addressed. So really thinking about what does it look like for there to be a thinking in continuums, because this is a problem that is much bigger than the slices that we've all taken for ourselves.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll keep remembering that bit about slices. Yeah, thank you very much, Lydia. Yeah, I think that's quite true. Last word.
I'm really grateful to have had this really engaging. Oh, am I on mute? No, I'm not. Engaging and thoughtful conversation with all of you. As I think through our conversation today, I think it is really critical, and I think we all say this, to look at what local solutions are already being implemented and see how we can amplify those. For smaller organizations like ours, we had to meet people where they are, figuring out how do you do virtual education when people don't have computers, for example, and how do you reach people? And they're not easy. They're not a one-stop solution of just clicking on a computer. It might require several phone calls or figuring out ways to be there for children that are losing out on a lot of things, not just education, like we said, and looking at the interconnectedness of all of these solutions we talked about into the bigger picture of equality and equity for all humans. So really kind of keeping the sight on that and really looking at how do we invest in local solutions that with very little resources are already, there are communities trying to figure out their ways through this challenge already. And we have a lot to learn from that. So I encourage all of us to look deeper into solutions that are coming from communities and then use data to help drive some of those solutions. And I really appreciate all of you for your incredible, thoughtful insights.
Thank you, Arti. And we know all of you, each of you have read about you. You're doing incredible work, bringing these solutions down to the people and really, driving innovation. So one last word, Davina, and then we close.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I totally agree with what's been said. This has been an excellent opportunity to really touch base on just a critical emerging area of interest. And I think that through discussions like this, we can start the process of coalition building and really crystallizing our policy recommendations as we're coming into very shortly, hopefully, a post-COVID society and world that's looking at reconstruction and the future. And the future is bright for these women. I think we're all agreed at a multilateral level. There are women like us working in the space that are not going to forget the girls that we need to bring up behind us and with us. So I think I'm very encouraged by the leadership that I see in this space, and I know that our commitment's never going to waver. So let's take this as a starting point and an opportunity to really think about how we can communicate to the stakeholders in our lives and connect them to the broader discussions we need to see real change.
Thank you so much. Yes, to see real change, that's the true purpose of even why we've had this webinar. We want to see real change. So thank you so much, our panelists. It's been great. To our attendees, thank you very much. There is a box for calling for donations. I think you've heard from everybody. It's the resource challenges we have, both even as civil society, even from the government. So, but each one of us is called to make a contribution. So I would like to say on behalf of and from everybody, everybody have a good day. Those in the US, those in Africa, it's time for bed, so have a good night. And we hope that we will be able to see real change and have a better future for our rural girls. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Ron.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.